So in this session, we will do it in two parts. The objective is to introduce to you the International Social Survey Program and some of the variables that are in there. So Martin, who has been managing the ISSP for the past 9 years or so, will give you an overview of the program, as well as the recent methodologies that we have used for the sampling side of it. And I've worked with Martin and Barry for the past 2 years on the past 2 surveys. And I've also analyzed some of the data. So I will share with you some of the findings and as well as talk about the data set from a user's perspective. So I hand over to Mike.
Oh, thanks for that, Komi. Yeah, as Komi just said, we are introducing the International Social Survey Program for those of you who have not been introduced before. And while the program has been going on as a cross-national research collaboration from 1984 with surveys every year from 1985. And each year they examine, in all of these different countries, they have a questionnaire on a specific social science topic so that questions are consistent across countries. And every 10 years or so, the topic is examined again, so they rotate around. New Zealand has been running surveys since 1991. From 91 to 2010, the survey was run out of Massey University. Phil Gendel at the Department of Marketing managed to pull that off for 20 years. And as Komi was saying, we're coming up to half of that. And I was always very impressed that they managed to do that. And it's just come around when I realized we've been almost that far, almost half as far. We also have the option each year to add in extra questions of specific interest, associated with the topic. And for the last couple of years, Komi has been instrumental in that process, as well as actually giving us a dedicated avenue for our own analysis of the data sets. In the past, it had sort of been here and there. Barry wrote an article on the flag referendum when we asked questions about that in 2015. And we had some things around the actual referenda in the 2016 role of government survey. But other than that, we haven't sort of dedicated the resources to that until last year when we ran the environment survey. We were missing, New Zealand didn't do a survey in 11 and 12 after Phil Gendel retired, and then we took it on in 2013. We had just gained survey experience through the New Zealand election study in 2011, and we've run that 2 more times, and then this since 2013. The final data are made freely available, both on our own collections through the University of Auckland's Figshare site and on the International Secretariat Archive, which is a German site through Nestar, which is a piece of software that we actually used to start a data archive in 2007. And we had some of the data from the original surveys there. That was then became a bit defunct because it was quite expensive and we weren't getting a lot of uptake of usage, but the University of Auckland then ran this Figshare collaboration repository that we hooked into. Also, Komi found, I didn't even know about this website, the data.gov.nz, links to our surveys there, and then our own Compass page, which I've got a shortened version of there, has information on all the surveys that we've run, and then shiny visualizations that we've put together as well for all of the surveys going back to the beginning of the New Zealand tenure, and links to the Figshare data as well. It also lists various publications that have come out of it and methods reports that we put together to describe what we do each year for the survey. Komi's put together a rather nice looking timeline here where you can see the different topics that have been analysed. Some of them don't come back or haven't come back. The leisure time and sports was a one-off. This is the first time we've run health and healthcare in New Zealand. At the moment, we've been running a year behind. So the health and healthcare 2021 survey we ran at the beginning of this year because we were going to start it in 2021 September and Auckland went into lockdown. We had even had the questionnaires printed, which meant that, unfortunately, when we revisited in January, we changed some of the extra questions that we'd added because they had been about focused on vaccine hesitancy, which was no longer such a thing by the time the survey actually came around, and then Komi turned it into more of a concerns about vaccination and ideas about how the outlay of vaccinations should go, and ideas for sort of policy and international distribution as well. As I said, it's generally a 10-year cycle, but it's definitely not sort of linear. Things come and go, and new topics have to come in. And in 2024, they are combining national identity and citizenship. And then I think there's the next one after that is on digital societies, which I think is relating to the social networks idea and possibly other things. So it changes with the times, but they do try to have questions that can be tracked over time. And Barry, as a member of the Secretariat, participates in meetings where they decide on the questions that are going to be in the next survey. As far as our sampling methodology, we've definitely been observing decreasing response rates. I was involved in a paper that was looking at various different surveys that are run mainly out of the University of Auckland that we can track the response rates. For instance, the election study started in 1990 with a response rate of around 63%. The last one that we were involved in had a response rate of around 30%. And our ASSP surveys as well have dropped to around about 20%, but that's somewhat to do with our more complicated methodology. Of course, with the IASSP, as opposed to an election survey as well, it differs every year also based on the topic. We certainly observed a lower response rate last year for the environment survey as compared to when we ran the religion survey in 2018, which also brought in responses from minority groups that we didn't sort of generally get such high response rates for because it was a topic of interest to them. Which brings me on to more of our sample stratification since 2018, since that survey, basically. We've been doing more complicated stratifying, sampling from the electoral roll, so we don't actually get a gender variable, but we impute that on the basis of title where it is given and name where it is not. So it's not perfect, but as a binary indicator, it is still a useful way of breaking down a response base like that, and we don't have any further information anyway. For age groups, generally we get 5-year age bands from the electoral roll. This year we had a health research topic, so we actually got 1-year bands, which was a nice change to be able to be more accurate with our 5-year bands. And for ethnicity, you only get Maori descent. And then we have used the fact that the mesh blocks are given in the electoral roll to work out where there are mesh blocks with a high concentration of Pacific people and a high concentration of Asian people, and we use those as the next levels of strata, and then everyone else after those 3 sort of groups have been derived. So the idea is we're oversampling minority groups and people we know are going to respond at a lower rate in order to get more people of those groups so that we can enable further subgroup analysis, and we don't end up with like 2 people representing a group and with huge survey weights attached. You can see here the numbers that we sampled in each of the our strata in the most recent survey, the health survey from this year, and then the response rates from those strata. The methods report for this is now online at the Compass site, as I linked earlier. So as we can see, no surprises, the sort of younger groups, especially Maori and Pacific, had a much lower response rate in general, and the higher age groups generally a much higher response rate. Interestingly, especially among Maori, higher rates. And by gender, we sampled more typically in the younger groups among females in that, well, among Maori at least. Barry's been sort of working these numbers to try and respond to what we see in our response rates in a given year. And the next year we changed them around to match where the responses were. This year we also boosted the sample size overall. We had sampled 5,500 in 2021 and got only 993 responses in total after the international body cut out a few of them because they weren't full enough. And the target actually is around about 1,000. we thought it had been 1,200, which we've not that often hit. But by adding another 600 into the mix, which is why the numbers on the in the right-hand column are a bit strange of the sample numbers, we ended up with 1,135 this year. And here you can see the representation we have in our data set as compared to in the electoral roll. We have larger proportions of older people, of course, because they're more likely to answer surveys in the first place. But we did, among the groups we were specifically targeting, the high Pacific and high Asian specific, especially, ended up with much higher proportions than are represented in the electoral rolls because we were sampling those specific mesh blocks. We did have to make sure there were enough people in our sample to begin with that we weren't sampling too specifically so that we'd be sampling the same people each year. We just did a check that they haven't at least been in the last 2 years of our sampling when we get the electoral rolls. And then, of course, we had to perform weighting because the results we get, the responses we get are definitely not in line with even our original electoral roll sample. And the plan has been to try and correct back to that sample, but we're now thinking we need to go back and correct to the census proportions as well, because the electoral roll is not necessarily representative of the groups that we're trying to reach or need to be representing. But you can see here an example of well, here's the variables that we're able to use in terms of we can get or we can match to the electoral roll, and then how it looked from our initial sample, and then after model correction, how the proportions looked. We've found that gender doesn't actually play a role in these models, but in terms of the actual corrections, we ended up uncorrecting for how close they were originally. And in occupation, some of the discrepancies are based on single digit and SCO coding are a bit too out there for it to correct, ideally. And then we end up with weights from this year. I think we had weights from around about 0.1 through to 10 and cut it at those extremes so that they weren't representing too many or too few people. And now I'm going to hand back over to Komi for talking about the comparative analysis and trends in various areas.
Yeah, so that would give you an idea of like how costly it is in terms of time, coordination, as well as money to run surveys like this, especially it being a postal survey plus online. But unfortunately, it seems like a data set that is underutilized in New Zealand. And that I say, firstly, from personal experience, having managed different social science, having done many social science research in the past, and in the literature that I've reviewed, I hardly come across reports or journal articles that mention the ISSB data. And also, if you look at the bar graph there, which is a count of the number of publications that's in the ISSB's database of publications. I mean, it's not an accurate count because not every single article would have been captured in the database, but it gives you a picture of underutilization. So over a period of 29 years, only 95 New Zealand publications. And of that, it's mainly university reports and journal articles, and only 2 reports by the Treasury. And this is despite the ISSB dataset containing many variables that are, I'd say, relevant and important for the different social issues that we are faced with. In a different project that I've been working on with the Public Policy Institute, I've looked at the living standards framework indicators a little bit more closely. And what I found was that the ISSB is not captured at all in any of the indicators, despite the ISSB offering like highly relevant indicators. Like, for example, one indicator was the environment, and the measure in there was based on this question that asked people from where they live, how easy it is to access a green space. I mean, that's kind of an indirect indicator of well-being. But the environment module contains a much more direct environment-related indicator, in that it asks people the frequency, how frequently they actually visit a green space, for example, like going to the beach, or nature-based activities, just basically spending time out in nature, bird watching and things like that. And it also asks people the extent to which they enjoy being outside in nature. So that's a much more direct measure of well-being. So if you look at these 5 indicators there: empowerment, social networks, trust in others, literally all 5 of them are well-being indicators that are mentioned in one way or another in the LSF. So if you look at unpaid work and gender division of household work, this is a very important indicator of gender-based social inequality in New Zealand. And as far as I know, the last time this was asked in surveys in New Zealand was in the Time Use survey back in 2009. So in other words, the ISSB often contains measures that are not typically asked in other social surveys in New Zealand. Like the religion, for example, offers some really interesting public perceptions about abortion and adultery. I mean, these are indicators, these are measures that kind of measure factors that can cause social tension in society, as well as social conflicts within families. The citizenship module asks people whether or not they have participated in a protest or boycotts or demonstration recently, or if they plan to. And this again is another measure of social tension. For example, the COVID-19 protests that happened a while ago that caused quite a bit of disruption in Wellington, and the more recent protests causing traffic jams and things like that. So in short, it's what I'm trying to say is that there are important data in there, but nobody's like using it. Besides the standardized questions that are asked across different countries, so that's the other thing, is that the same questions are asked in the 43 different countries. In New Zealand, we also sometimes add additional questions, like, for example, in the past 5 years or so, we have measured, we've asked people whether they have internet access at home, whether they have an email account. So that is a measure of maybe the digital divide, but it's also important information for us to look at if we are considering moving surveys like this to a fully online platform. So one of the unique advantages of the ISSB is that it allows for comparing data internationally, so cross-national comparison. So if we want to claim that we're a country of law-abiding citizens, the best way to do that would be to compare ourselves to other countries, right? But as you can see there, we cannot make that claim. So only about a third of us believe that that we should be obeying the laws all the time. That means the majority think that it's okay to occasionally break the law sometimes. So the countries that I've highlighted in green have shown like an increase in trends across the decades in terms of people believing that we should always obey the law. And if we compare ourselves to Spain and Israel, the perceptions around law abidance is much stronger there. So what does that tell us about ourselves as a nation? it partly explains maybe our attitudes towards laws, like occasionally breaking traffic laws, lockdown laws. This is another interesting indicator that I thought would be of interest to the audience here today, is about public perception of trust towards civil servants. As you can see there, the level of trust is quite low, only about a third, although there's a trend of about 6% per decade increase in trust, which is promising, but it's still quite low if we compare ourselves to Switzerland, in Ireland, and Hungary even. But if you want to compare ourselves to, say, Russia, in Czech Republic, and Japan, the level of trust here is much higher. Again, trust in MPs is pretty low, although there's a 4% increase per decade. But then it's quite low in all countries, except perhaps for Hungary and Switzerland, where it's slightly a little bit higher. This question is about public perceptions of whether or not they think the income gap between the rich and poor is too large. So the data here shows that the majority in most countries believe that the income gaps in their respective countries is too large. And in the same questionnaire, they are asked if they think it is the government's responsibility to reduce this income gap. For some countries like Austria, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, that also indicated that the income gap is too large. In those same countries, people believe that it's the government's responsibility to reduce the income gap. But in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and United States, although the perception of income gap is quite prevalent, there's a small portion there of people who don't think that it's the government's responsibility to reduce the income gap. Why that is, we don't know. Two possible reasons. Maybe there's a perception that the government is already doing enough to try and reduce the income gap. And the second reason may be a perception that income is a personal rather than public responsibility. So in short, the ISSP does offer lots of very valuable and interesting data that's in the different modules. The snapshots that I showed you are just like selected examples. Usually the questionnaire themselves are about 12 pages of questions, including demographic data. So there's lots of interesting variables in there. And I can't understand why it's not utilized more than it is currently. I think maybe having a cumulative database similar to the IDI, maybe, where everything is in one portal, that might make it easier for researchers to utilize the data. But then again, the data sets are there and freely available. So yeah, please do contact us if you are ever interested to know a little bit more about any of these surveys, and we are happy to help out. And with that, I conclude. Any questions? The sample size varies from year to year. You want to talk on that?
So this year for the health questionnaire, we sent out 6,000 questionnaires and we ended up with 1,135 responses back. To say the year before we did 5,500 and just got just under 1,000, and that had been around about 5,500 had been for the previous years before that, as compared to, I think it was more like 3,000 that he sent out in the 90s and 2000s. And it was also much simpler stratification. But again, our stratification almost makes it like we have going to get a lower response rate because we're focusing on getting that representativeness, which is, as we know with the way we do it from electoral rolls, there is no sort of better way to focus on the minority groups you're targeting for something like the election survey, where you get like 3,500 responses maybe, but a far smaller number of specific ethnicity responses, because they are unable to target them in the other way, and it is just throwing more and more money at the problem for more sample.
And so those are 6,000 like paper surveys sent out?
Yes.
What's the sort of thoughts on online?
So we send out a C4 envelope, sort of big, about just a bit bigger than the A4 piece of paper. We send out a 16-page survey in a booklet form, and this year, for the first time, we added in we have a return envelope in there of the same size. And this year we added in an option to return via courier, because Barry was thinking that people have not been wanting to leave their homes. It's been harder to find post boxes. And so there's this option they can just get it picked up from the door. I'm still actually finding out from the mail people how many actually came back via courier. The difficulty there is also that normally it just comes back through the mail and it goes into one big University of Auckland mail receipt account, whereas this time they were able to track exactly which ones were ours, and so we should be able to get an idea of how much we paid in that regard. But this was all these different innovations also means that it's very hard to track the effect of that, because it was a different survey topic from last year, and we had this different option, and we increased the sample size. And so but yes, we send out those with a thing saying, if you want to fill it out online, here is the address, here is your survey ID. And we only include a survey ID so that we know you've responded, and we don't need to send reminders to you, and we can put you in prize draws, because we have a postcard reminder, and then we send out a second questionnaire about a month and 2 months after the initial mail out. We've also been involved in a survey recently where it was just an invitation to complete online, and that was to specifically people of Maori descent. The benefit of that is you've got a much smaller envelope and you're just sending a couple of pages, so you can afford to send way more, like they sent 40,000 in the initial sample. The response rate to that, of course, not very comparable. It was entirely a Maori sample, but it ended up being around about 10%. And the emails that were coming back in, unfortunately, they had set up a website that hadn't been indexed yet by Google, and so people were searching for the website as they do, and not coming out with any luck. So a combination. I mean, I think it's a good thing to be moving towards, but I like that we went through a period where we were sending people a pen saying, here's your paper questionnaire, here's a pen to fill it out with. And then the mail changed to new expensive scanners that couldn't cope with a non-uniform thickness in the envelope. And they told us this after we'd enveloped 5,000 with a pen in them. And then we had to pay extra for that rather than unpick 5,000 envelopes and take the pen out. But yeah, changes that we're going like, well, what if we do this? Can we make it better for this? There's still the idea of receiving a paper copy, especially for a survey that is 16 pages long, and we say will take about 25 to 30 minutes to complete. And the Maori one we'd be doing, I've seen a lot of things where people sort of get to a certain point and then it's just like, then it cuts off. They don't come back and complete. And we did find a way in Qualtrics to get it to display an actual decent survey percentage complete. But it's only at the top of the page, and only if they scroll to the top. So I don't know how long it's got to go. And it's also like we included a QR code with that survey where it's like, it's really hard to complete on the phone for that long a period. That survey, we also included a te reo translation in Qualtrics, which was a fascinating process. But it was really, obviously still going to be quite a niche thing, but it was a wonderful thing to be able to include. But I think more along the lines of including more things to make it better in the short term. What do you think?
Honestly, I'm not sure this is behind Molly's question, but we do send out a lot of paper.
Oh, yeah.
And partly this is driven by a sampling method where we use the electoral roll where you get an address, and that's all you get.
Yeah.
So if the electoral had someone's email on it, then that would really facilitate a push to web type approach, or without use of any paper. So even the push to web that Martin mentioned for the Te Marama survey, that's an envelope in the mail, which may go straight in the bin, In some cases, it gets open and you'll just get it to online to complete it. Back to Mariana's point, what sample size would make government set up in notice? So is 1,000 too small for find out some of these attitudes, the well-being attitudes?
You know, even with, let's say you load it into idea and you would try to educate a certain population, then it would be, you know, too low. But it's not loaded into idea to start with, you know, so what is it?
No, it's not. But I'm just thinking, is that one of the issues? That government might use it if it was bigger.
I think if it was bigger and if it would be in idea, it would get used just like how GS is used in Java and so on.
GS is what, 7 grand? 7,000?
Grand.
6,100, something like that. Somewhere, I think it is the person. Yeah. Yes, and then, you know, if you have a large enough population, we can find a solution. But it kind of like limits its use to just using it by itself. And I guess that could be as well.
Yeah, and of course, the interesting thing is that the ISSB, you know, seeking a response set of around about 1,000 from all various countries of various sizes. Like for us, a response rate, you know, response set of 1,000 looks quite different from a response set in Canada of 1,000 people. In terms of
India.
Yeah, in terms of probably the number, who knows what their response rates like? I don't actually know. Is there information on response rates for different countries?
Probably,
Yeah.
yeah.
But it's certainly it's just a matter of money for more responses, and we've always the idea of sending out the paper copy, ending up with a higher response rate, and thinking, you know, well, we're being more statistically robust, but as Barry says with the paper, it is a process where you order in thousands of envelopes, and then I mean, we've been doing a manual process for this because we have the sort of you know, those identities across the envelopes. This year, for the other one, we found they could do it entirely at the mail house, and it was like, well, that was much easier than stuffing 40,000 envelopes. And they say, you know, it's all tracked through barcodes and things, but for especially with the courier return envelope, that was all manual, and I'm not sure they can automate that because it's all custom stickers that have to be generated at the time. But that all takes time and all adds to the cost. And they said, you know, it's more accurate if we do it this way. Well, I can understand that with the process that they have in place, but when we were part of an expenditure at the university to order a large envelope stuffing machine, it was one that wouldn't handle what we were doing in terms of the length of the surveys and things. So unfortunately, that wasn't a great avenue. But to get 2,000 would be a completely different survey from our perspective. Yeah. Through the fig share link that I had earlier on the slides, or really just straight through our Compass website, you can find through our projects and surveys. The data sets are there on that fig share repository, and on the International Archive.
Yeah, on the International Archive, the data sets are sometimes available as a cumulative file. So across years and all the countries together in one huge data set. But in our web, sorry. Some countries have weights.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, but not all countries have weights though. Yeah.
And that's the other thing is the New Zealand data sets also didn't have weights in the past, and then there was in the business school where we collaborated on the work orientation survey in 2014. They had a PhD student who wanted to analyze that module back in time in New Zealand, and so we retrospectively created some weights based on the nearest census to those. And it's sort of quite interesting idea to have, you know, try and make these things more representative, but only when there is a desire for people to actually analyze it. And that's the thing we don't know.
I mean, this is related to what I understood, but if you were to government, but not the archive, they already have access to this. So it's sort of
yeah, then all you've got going for you is these sort of custom questions that aren't asked elsewhere, and that's a hard sell.
Yes, no, I mean, custom questions, as Tony pointed out, you're not getting anywhere else.
Yeah.
Another example here was I was approached during COVID because we were the only ones who had data on differences in group size, the number of people that people have contact with on a daily basis.
There was a social networks one.
Looking at how people like to spread a virus. That data isn't available.
Right.
We didn't have it much, and it's people's only place of existence.
And we had also, they require you to ask the number of adults in the household, the number of children above school age and within school age and then under school age. And it always confuses people somehow, the number of people they have in their households. But we had for a few years a grid of saying, who else is in the household with you? And you still got some interesting data, but it's still, tells you more about the household in the same way as what the census does, but with these other questions. Of course, if it could be linked to things that told you more information about these people, it would be amazing. But we don't, have the identity of the people as far as the linking them would go.
The special question.
Yes, and some of them, especially in the more recent surveys, that the additional questions have come specifically out of Komi's desire to research things. So it's been very interesting just to seeing how people respond to that. We even had, for the environment survey last year, she had people's perceptions, what they perceived about the environment during lockdowns, things and changes in the environment, and a free text question of just they could put additional comments, and that was, I think, a way for some people to get things off their chest, which was good.
You probably mentioned this earlier, maybe I missed it, so apologies, but who funds it?
We funded
Yeah, we've had
internal funding.
university,
Yeah.
a couple of university funding grants for some of that. We've had collaborations in the past with people in the business school there, and we tried for a couple of ministry collaborations once or twice that didn't pan out. But
one year for the religion survey.
Oh, yeah.
The Templeton Foundation.
Oh.
and that one was very interesting because that was another finding, was that the religion survey, we had Joe Bobillier at the University of Auckland in theology at the time, and he then wanted to do the same survey the next year. And in the intervening year, we'd had the mosque shootings in Christchurch. And so it was going to be very interesting to see people's changes in attitudes, especially seeing as it asked questions about your attitudes to people of different religions. So we sent out the survey to the people who had responded the year before, and still only got about 25% of them responding with a follow-up. So it's like, it was much, much smaller again. And that was an unfortunate finding, but it was quite interesting. It's also difficult, sort of, what the university ethics will allow us to do in that regard. Elaine.
I had a thought on this question. From whatever limited experience I've got working in the public sector, I think these are all really useful variables, but complementary variables. So linking them to other data sets would be really useful, and would the government agencies would then be using it a lot more, I think, because I don't see anyone just using this survey to whatever work the government agencies do. It would be more like a research-based organizations that might use the survey data.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And they, I think, in most countries, they are run out of universities mainly, Barry?
It's a real mess. Yeah, someone's private companies.
Right. But none of them are feeding into sort of linked things of their own, as far as we know, other than linking this across countries, which I guess is what it has instead.